You, how are you? How are you? Are you having a good day? Please hit the like and subscribe. Let me know I'm doing a good job. Welcome to the Dealer's Book Series. I'm Christina K-R-I-S-T-I-N-A. This is where we read books and talk about books. No special effects, no theme music, no special lighting, no special nothing. I've been wanting to do this particular video for months. For months. So now I'm just going to do it and get it over with. Because I love it. Please check out my Star Trek Next Generation recaps on Fridays. Please also check out my If Then videos on Fridays. If you like this author, then maybe you like that author. I did one on Black authors that no one is watching. I did one on Native American detectives that no one is watching. I did vampires and werewolves and fae and homicide and FBI and some cozies. We're going to do a lot more cozies. We did the Regency series with the Bridgertons and the Sinsters and the Sherbrooks, all of it. So I have been wanting to do this. Maybe you saw last week I did the reading order and I went through it quite quickly. Now I'm going to go through the reading order again, but I am going to dedicate this to Mrs. Ellsworth. This is Victoria Thompson Gaslight series dedicated to Mrs. Ellsworth. I love Mrs. Ellsworth. I've got a new toy. It cost me $20 whole, and I'm trying it out to see if it works, because I don't think it's working at all. Because you know what they said? It only works when it turns green. It's not green. But it cost me, oh, look at that. Now it's green. It cost me $20. So let me know if it works or not. Interviewing. Yeah. Look, it's not even green anymore. So let's get going. This is Mrs. Ellsworth. And so, don't forget Flashback Mondays, where I talk about all the books in the Romantic Times Book Review magazine. I usually cover up to at least 50 or 60 books. Sometimes I get carried away and go to 70. I try to cover historicals and contemporary romance and inspirationals and paranormals and sci-fi and harlequins and erotica. Try and cover it all. So how you doing there, ma'am? So, book 1. Murder on Astor Place, when we first meet Sarah and Frank Malloy and Mrs. Ellsworth. And Mrs. Ellsworth is prominent in the early books, and then she starts to slide off later on. So there'll be less quotes in the later books and more quotes in the earlier books. So let's get started. Now, some of these are just her talking, and some of them are plot related, but you can go back and check my my videos for each individual book, and if you want to learn more about the circumstances around the quotes, the first one, Murder on Astor Place. Good morning, Mrs. Ellsworth. Sarah called as she reached the stoop where the old woman was sweeping. Mrs. Ellsworth looked up in apparent surprise, her wrinkled face breaking into a delighted smile. Mrs. Brandt, don't tell me you've been out all night. I certainly have, delivering a fat baby girl who had made up her mind to come into the world backwards. Oh my, I hope all is all right. Right as they can be. Only then did Sarah realize that something wasn't quite right with Mrs. Ellsworth sweeping. Were you sweeping the dirt into the house? She asked in alarm. Could the old woman be losing her mental facilities? Of course I was, she replied, without the slightest hesitation. This is a new broom. She held it up so Sarah could see for herself. You've got to sweep something into the house before you sweep anything out with it, or else all your luck will be swept out the door. Surely you knew that. Right? The next one. Uh, if you want to know her identity, go check out Dirty 30 New Year's Eve video. And all of my Janets up to that. And there's a new Janet coming out in a couple months. So we're going to get into that. So she introduces Mrs. Ellsworth to Frank. Mrs. Ellsworth, this is Detective Sergeant Malloy of the New York City Police. Mr. Malloy, this is Mrs. Ellsworth. The old lady was still looking him over very carefully, obviously feeling he needed to pass inspection before she'd leave him alone with Sarah. I dropped a knife this morning, she said, as if that should mean something. When no one responded, she continued, that's how I knew I'd be getting a visitor soon. Although I guess you're really Sarah's visitor, aren't you? So perhaps I'd best be on my way. So nice to have made your acquaintance, Detective Sergeant. I love Mrs. Ellsworth. Let's see. Um, uh, Looks like it's going to be another warm one today, Mrs. Brandt. Off to deliver a baby this morning, are you? No, I've got an appointment. Be careful then. I've baked some bread this morning and the top of the loaf split. I've been worried sick ever since. You know what that means, don't you? That there's going to be a funeral soon? It won't be mine, Sarah assured her. But I'll be careful. And um she was hardly down. She was hardly down her front steps, however, when someone called out a warning. Stop, dear. Don't go any further. Mrs. Ellsworth cried, hurrying down her own porch steps. Apparently, she'd been watching out her front window for something to happen in the neighborhood that would require her attention. You dropped your glove. She looked to see if it lying near the top step and started back up for it. Don't pick it up, Mrs. Ellsworth said, shrieked in terror, causing Sarah to nearly stumble on the steps. Bad luck, you know, she explained when Sarah gaped at her. Sarah swallowed down her expectations. Am I supposed to let it lie there, she asked, trying not to sound sarcastic. Of course not, Mrs. Ellsworth said, her eyes wide at a ridiculous notion. I'll pick it up for you, and that's good fortune for you, to have someone else pick up your glove. Amazingly spry for her age, she brushed past Sarah and flitted up the steps, snatching the glove, then handing it back to Sarah with a flourish. There. Well, thank you, Sarah said. Book 1. Murder on Astor Place. Book 2. Murder on St. Mark's. There's only one quote in this one. I don't know if it's book related or not. It's been a while. Please go check out my video for it. The next morning, Mrs. Ellsworth was on Sarah's doorstep bright and early, her wrinkled face pale and drawn, and her graying hair done up so hastily the knot sat crooked on her head. Oh, Mrs. Brandt, I had to see that you were all right. I had the most terrible dream last night, and then this morning. She clutched at her chest, grasping for breath, and Sarah quickly took her arm and led her inside. Sit down right here and let me listen to your heart, she said, putting her in the chair beside her desk in the examining room. Are you having any pain? Oh, goodness, no. I just can't seem to get my breath. I was so frightened when I saw it. The dream, you mean? No, the cricket. Sarah was just about to put the stethoscope in her ears, but stopped at this. You were frightened by a cricket? Not just any cricket. Everyone knows that cricket in the house is good luck. Unless it's a white cricket, of course. This one was pure white, and you know what that means. No, I don't. Mrs. Ellsworth closed her eyes and laid her hand over her heart again. Sarah reached out, fully expecting her to keel over and ready to break the fall, but she didn't move. She said only death. The white cricket means a death is coming to someone close. And then there was my dream. You were in it, Mrs. Brandt. You were running and running, trying to catch someone, but you couldn't. And then I saw her. I couldn't see her face, but she was dead, and I was so afraid. Well, I had to make sure you were all right, didn't I? Murder on St. Mark's Place. Murder on Gramercy Park. There's 2 quotes in here. Hello, Mrs. Branch, she called cheerfully. How are you today, Mrs. Ellsworth? Sarah replied. Since Mrs. Ellsworth had once saved her life, Sarah would indulge her whenever she could. Oh, I'm feeling quite cheerful, Mrs. Branch. My apron fell off this morning, and that gave me quite a laugh. This didn't seem particularly funny to Sarah, but she knew Mrs. Ellsworth well enough to know there must be some hidden meaning in the event. Mrs. Ellsworth found hidden meaning in just about everything that happened. And why did you find this so funny? Because when an apron falls off, it means the wearer is going to have a baby within the year. Sarah had to laugh at this too. Mrs. Ellsworth was in no danger of having a baby this or any year. Perhaps someone is going to leave one on your doorstep, she suggested. Wouldn't that be something, Mrs. Ellsworth said. I don't think I even remember what to do with a baby, but it's been so long. It's a nice thought, though. And one more. Um, Hello, Mrs. Brandt. Have you been delivering a baby today? Not today, Sarah replied. That's good, she said as Sarah stopped beside her porch. I dropped my scissors this morning and they landed point down and stuck in the floor. That's too bad, Sarah said. I hope it didn't leave a mark. Oh my, that's the least of it. Don't you know that when scissors stick in the floor, it's a bad omen of death? Dear me, the last time I had an omen like that, some poor girl you knew died. Murder on Washington Square. Oh Lord, there's a bunch of quotes in this one. Shall we get to it? Um, Mr. Malloy hasn't seen fit to keep me informed of Brian's progress, so I'm going to see for myself, Sarah said. Good for you, Mrs. Ellsworth said approvingly. Please tell Mr. Malloy I send my best wishes for the boy. I'll be seeing Mr. Malloy, Sarah said. I'm sure he's working at this time. Mrs. Ellsworth's wrinkles slid into a frown. You're going to visit Mr. Malloy's mother, then? I'm going to visit his son, Sarah corrected her with a smile, but I'm afraid his mother will most certainly be there, too. Mrs. Ellsworth shook her head. Sarah had told her that Mrs. Malloy didn't approve of her son's acquaintance with Sarah. So, because of Sarah's visit, you can't be too careful. Here, take this. She came down her porch step and pressed a shiny new penny into Sarah's hand. Sarah couldn't help herself. This will protect me from the evil eye. Pennies are notoriously lucky, Mrs. Ellsworth assured her. I'd give you a rabbit's foot, but I don't seem to have one with me. The only other thing I have is a nutmeg, she said, pulling it out of her pocket to prove it. Nutmegs are also very lucky, but only in protecting you from rheumatism and boils. But they also say that the rabbit's foot wasn't lucky for the rabbit, and I'd rather have the penny than the rabbit's foot. Okay. Oh, shoot. Just a second. Uh, Next, knew something terrible was going to happen, Miss Ellsworth confided to Sarah as they cleaned up the kitchen after their meager supper. Remember I asked if you'd heard knocking the other night? Yes, Sarah said, not really certain. She didn't make an effort to remember all of Mrs. Ellsworth's superstitions. I heard it 3 nights in a row. That means someone is going to die. I knew it was going to happen, and I was so afraid it would be someone I knew, she said sadly as she looked towards the dishes off the tray she'd taken up to Nelson earlier. He hadn't come down, but he'd barely touched the food on the tray. So this is when Nelson's going through his trouble at the bank. All right, next one. Um, Frank stood where Mrs. Ellsworth could see him through her back window in the fading light. The door opened only a few seconds after he'd knocked, and Mrs. Ellsworth greeted him as if he were the prodigal son. "Oh, Mr. Malloy, how good of you to come. I dropped a knife this afternoon, so I knew a gentleman would be calling. I hoped it was you, not another one of those awful reporters." Okay, there's a lot in this book. Um, uh, What are you doing out in this weather? The old woman scowled Sarah when she opened her back door to admit her. "And I can see you have an engagement. Is it with Mr. Malloy?" Sarah couldn't help smiling at the thought. "No, I'm going to visit my parents this evening." She decided not to mention the purpose of the visit so they wouldn't be disappointed if she wasn't successful in saving Nelson's job. "Oh dear, I've had a tingling in my left eye all day. That's not a good sign, you know. The right eye means good fortune, but the left eye, well, I don't know how much more bad news I can bear." And the final one in this book. The hour was late by the time Sarah finally arrived at Bellevue. She found Mrs. Ellsworth dozing in her chair, her chin resting on her ebony chest, her breathing coming in unladylike snores. Oh, Mrs. Branch," she said in relief. Then she instinctively looked at Prescott. "How is he?" "He's doing fairly well." "Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, he's not doing as poorly as he was." "I'm glad to hear it," the old woman replied. "You've done a good job." None. You can't say someone is doing better in a hospital because then they'll do worse or something like that. I forget. So that was Book 4, Murder on Washington Square. Book 5, Murder on Mulberry Bend. There's 4 quotes in here. Uh, Oh my, what a nice thing to do. I hope you have included some shoes in your donation. Giving someone a pair of shoes is very good luck. I'm afraid no, wait. I was wrong about that," Mrs. Ellsworth corrected herself, frowning in concentration. "It may be new shoes that bring good luck. I'm not sure what old shoes bring." Oh yes, I am. They're good luck for the bride and groom, aren't they? To tie behind their carriage. Yes, so that they must be good luck for everyone, don't you think? Next quote. Mrs. Ellsworth says, "You can't open an umbrella in the house," Mrs. Ellsworth informed her, appalled. She hastily dropped her own onto the floor and snatched Sarah's to close it. "What were you thinking?" She'd been thinking it would dry more quickly if it were open, but of course she didn't say that to Mrs. Ellsworth. "I suppose that's bad luck," she guessed. Mrs. Ellsworth's superstitions were legion. "It certainly is," she said, clutching the offending object to her as if she could shelter it from the evil spirits that might be ready to descend. "I had no idea," Sarah admitted apologetically. "I'll be more careful in the future." Then she reached down to pick up the umbrella that Mrs. Ellsworth had dropped in her haste to rescue Sarah. "Don't touch that!" Mrs. Ellsworth cried, startling Sarah all over again. She jumped and hastily straightened, holding both hands out to prove she had obeyed the command. "It can't be bad luck just to pick up an umbrella, can it?" "It's bad luck to let someone else pick up an umbrella you've dropped," she explained, as if to a child bending to pick it up herself. "Of course, now that I remember, the bad luck is that you'll become a spinster for the rest of your life. Since I'm not in any danger of becoming a spinster, I suppose it's all right after all." Okay. Um, Good evening, Mrs. Ellsworth. I hope you're keeping well, he said. "I'm fine, thank you, Malloy. I knew you'd be calling tonight. Either you or Mr. Dennis. I dropped a knife at dinner. Knife falls, gentleman calls, or at least that's what they say." uh, Final one in this book. Um, She had to ask Mrs. Ellsworth to help in getting into the costume her mother had loaned her. She thought modern clothes were cumbersome, but the French Queen Marie Antoinette had borne the added burden of an enormously elaborate hairstyle. "My goodness," Mrs. Ellsworth exclaimed when she saw the wig. "Did women really put battle scenes in their black hair then? The French had an odd notion of style, I suppose." "Oh, She picked up a comb to part her hair so she could start wrapping it tightly around her head to go under the wig. But Mrs. Ellsworth cried out a warning that startled her into dropping it to the floor. Good heavens, the old woman said, picking up the comb and placing it out of Sarah's reach. You can't comb your hair at night. It's bad luck. How many women comb their hair every night before going to bed? How many romance novels, how many Regency romance novels have women combing their hair at night before going to bed? Wasn't anything safe to do around Mrs. Ellsworth? How am I supposed to get this wig on then? Sarah said. You use a brush, of course. That's why women only brush their hair at night. Ah, I love Mrs. Ellsworth. Book 6. Murder on Marble Row. There's 2 quotes in here. Let's check these out. Um, uh, She smiled at the memory. As a matter of fact, I was there yesterday. How is it the dear little girl, Aggie, the one you're so fond of? She's doing fine, I suppose, but what? Mrs. Ellsworth came closer instinctively to her. She really doesn't belong there. She's too young. Um, this is just the talk over adopting Catherine. Um, You may just have to take matters into your own hands, Mrs. Ellsworth said. What does that mean? I can't take care of a child, Mrs. Ellsworth. Look at me. I'm on my way to deliver a baby. Yeah, but you adopt Maeve. So that works. Alright, and so that really wasn't a Miss Ellsworth quote. That was just Miss Ellsworth lending her support. Let's see. Uh Someone sneezes. Oh no, I'm perfectly healthy, Mrs. Ellsworth assured her. Sneezing for no reason on a Friday means sorrow. You see, it means something different for each day of the week. Sneeze on Monday, sneeze for danger. Sneeze on Tuesday, kiss a stranger. I love it. That was book 6. Book 7. Murder on Lenox Hill. One quote. Um, uh, so Mrs. Ellsworth is here. When Sarah had first considered bringing Aggie to live with her, Mrs. Ellsworth had volunteered to care for her children. Okay. Um, when Sarah had to work. Sarah could never have asked her to do such a thing, and she relieved when a volunteer at the mission had suggested that one of the other girls would be an excellent nanny for Aggie. The decision had allowed Mrs. Ellsworth to play grandmother to the girls whenever she liked, a situation that suited them all perfectly. So she's teaching them how to bake a cake. The girls picked up the spoon that lay on the table, but she didn't get a good grip on it, and it fell from her hand, clattering back onto the tabletop. Oh my, looks like we'll be having a visitor, Mrs. Ellsworth said. Is that what it means when you drop a spoon? Maeve asked with great interest. In the weeks she'd been acquainted with Mrs. Ellsworth, she learned that the old woman knew a superstition for practically everything that happened. Only if the spoon falls on the table. If it falls on the floor, then it depends on how it lands. If the bowl is up, that means good fortune. If the bowl is down, that means disappointment. The bowl is up. Does that mean our visitor will bring us good fortune? I love it. I love it. Book 8, Murder in Little Italy. 2 quotes. I love sharing these books. I love sharing these books. Um, uh, One of my patients was murdered the night before last, Sarah says. Good heavens, Mrs. Ellsworth said, taking a seat at the table. I was afraid something like that would happen. I saw a crow on your back fence on Monday morning. It's an omen of death. I didn't say anything because I know how you feel about my superstitions. I was just hoping you wouldn't have to deliver a baby that day. And one more. Uh, As quickly as she could, she gathered her things and bid the girls goodbye. When she came back into the front parlor, she found Mrs. Ellsworth comforting Lorenzo. They say that a baby who cries long will live long, she said. Murder in Chinatown, Book 9. There's one quote in here. Uh, oh dear, let's see. Um, Mrs. Mrs. Ellsworth's eyebrows rose. She suggested that you question them. No, she suggested someone question them. She was right. Angel had eloped with a man she'd been seeing secretly. That's it then. When this angel was killed, Maeve felt a kind of kinship with her. I hope you explained the truth to her. I tried, but it's impossible to know if I succeeded. Or at least I made her think a bit, but she's still upset about Angel's death. Catherine is too. Um, oh, here we go. Mrs. Ellsworth refused to smile. This is serious, she said. You've got a family now, a child who depends on you. I know. I'm not going to take any foolish chances, even if Malloy would let me. Mrs. Ellsworth sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Then she said, Do you have a handkerchief? Sarah blinked in surprise at the sudden change of topic. Of course, reaching into her pocket and pulling one out. No lady would be caught without a handkerchief any more than she would go outside naked. It's clean, she said, adding, thinking Mrs. Ellsworth wanted to use it. Instead, she took it and tied a knot in one corner. There, that will protect you. Sarah stared at the knotted fabric. Protect me from what? Yourself, I'd say. I don't expect for a minute that you'll be able to keep from helping Mr. Malloy with this murder investigation, but a knot in your handkerchief will ward off evil. Don't you just love Mrs. Ellsworth? Don't you just love Mrs. Ellsworth? Oh, book 10's got quite a few quotes. So we may have to slow it down here. Let's see what these say. Um, Mrs. Ellsworth is getting them out of the oven right now, Maeve reported. She said you'd probably like to come home to something sweet. Mrs. Ellsworth was right. Mrs. Ellsworth was the elderly lady who lived next door. She once filled her lonely life with gossip about her neighbors. Now she spent her time teaching Maeve and Catherine the joys of homemaking. Welcome home, Mrs. Brent. Mrs. Ellsworth greeted her in the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. You're just in time. So I heard, or rather smelled. Can't remember the last time I had fresh, hot correspondence. Oh, and coffee. Mrs. Ellsworth says we need to know how to cook so we can catch husbands, Maeve informed her. Sarah exchanged a glance with Mrs. Ellsworth. A man doesn't want a wife who can't keep a house or fix his meals. Maybe you should be teaching Mrs. Brant how to cook then, Maeve said. So Mr. Malloy will marry her. Wink, wink, wink. Alright, page 36. See what this one says. I knew something was wrong, Mrs. Ellsworth said the next morning when Sarah told her what Malloy had said the night before. I dropped an egg this morning and it didn't break. That means bad luck. We haven't had any bad luck yet, Sarah reminded her. Something to change your luck, she mused, rubbing her chin thoughtfully. That's what we need. Oh, I know. If a bird leaves a dropping on you, that's good luck. Sarah gasped. Are you suggesting I go outside and try to get a bird to plop on my head? What? Oh, no, dear. No. Besides, if you wanted a bird to do that, it never would. I love her. Let's see what this next one is. The elder woman pretended to be surprised, although Sarah knew she'd probably been aware of her presence since she turned at the corner. Good morning, Mrs. Brant. I hope you haven't been out all night. Oh, no, I was just doing some follow-up visits. Oh, I'm so glad, she said. Oh, my, I think if you look around your bottom step there, you'll see something of interest, Mrs. Ellsworth said. Intrigued, Sarah walked over to her own porch and dutifully looked around. Her porch wasn't as clean as Mrs. Ellsworth's, so she saw lots of things lying about, but nothing of particular interest. And then Mrs. Ellsworth guides her around and she finds a tooth. "Oh my, did you find a tooth?" she exclaimed. "What good luck. Teeth aren't good luck, good fortune by themselves, you know. But if you just happen to find one, then they're very good luck indeed. How could a tooth happen to be falling in front of my house? Could it have just fallen out of someone's mouth as they walked by? Who knows?" And a final quote in this book. I love Mrs. Ellsworth. Um, the girl said, "Mr. See me so I can find. Um, uh, Maeve described their activities with a little help from Catherine whenever Maeve prodded her. By then, the water had boiled and the tea had brewed. Mrs. Ellsworth poured 3 cups and set them on the table. As she set down the last one, the spoon lying on the saucer slipped off and clattered to the table. "Oh my, we're going to have a visitor," Mrs. Ellsworth said. "I thought a spoon falling meant disappointment," Maeve said, making Sarah wince. She'd have to remind the girl again about not believing the superstitions. "Only if it lands on the floor with the bowl facing down. If it lands on the table, it means a visitor." Mr. Malloy was coming by. Book 11. One quote. Murder on Waverly Place. Towards the end of the book. Almost the last page. Oh, I remember this. Mrs. Ellsworth smiled mysteriously. "Perhaps not all of them, dear. Remember Seraphina told me where I could find my late husband's watch?" "That's right," Maeve remembered. "Didn't she say it would be something with the letter B?" "Yes, she did," Mrs. Ellsworth reported. "And that's where I found it, hidden in the fireplace." "Fireplace doesn't start with B," Sarah pointed out. "No, it doesn't," Mrs. Ellsworth agreed with some satisfaction. "But it was behind a loose brick where my husband put it." Book 12. There's 2 quotes, or one long one. Murder on Lexington Avenue. Should have done this earlier in the day. This is the middle of the night, by the way, at my house. The middle of the night. The The best thing about this time of year is the fresh fruit, Mrs. Ellsworth was saying as she pulled a pie out of the oven. "I never had a peach pie before," Maeve said. "I've never even saw enough peaches at once to make a pie." "I love peaches," Catherine informed them all, looking up from her half-eaten one she was cradling in her hands. "I do too." "Look how many pies we've got," Maeve said, looking at the collection they had cooling on the flat surface in the room. "Can you count, Catherine, and tell me how many we have?" "Oh, no," Mrs. Ellsworth claimed in alarm. "You mustn't count them once they've come out of the oven. They'll go bad." Sarah and Maeve exchanged a glance, but Sarah decided not to scold her neighbor for her superstition. "Well, however many we have, we are going to do with all of them." I love it. I love Mrs. Ellsworth. Book 13, Murder on Sisters Row. Let's see. 2 quotes. Uh, I don't see the one here. Um, "You're forgetting the rumors about Mr. Van Owner," Malloy said, "that he likes prostitutes, but would he like having one under his house?" Okay, that doesn't work. Alright, let me see what this other one is. Um, they're explaining to Mrs. Ellsworth, but okay, we'll let that go. Okay, next book, Murder on Fifth Avenue. There's 2 quotes. Let's see. Um, Sarah took Mrs. Ellsworth's coat and called the girls to come down and greet her. A few minutes later, they were in the kitchen enjoying the cookies when Sarah's front bell rang again. This time, a very excited young man had come to tell Sarah his wife was in labor and she had to come right away. I knew it, Mrs. Ellsworth said as they helped Sarah pack her medical bag. I saw 4 crows on the back fence this morning. You know what they say, 1 crow means sorrow, 2 crows means joy, 3 crows mean a wedding, and 4 a birth. What do 5 crows mean? Maeve says a mess in your backyard. One more in this book. I just enjoy Mrs. Ellsworth so much. I've been wanting to do this for weeks. Let's see. Well, of course, I'd known you were here. I'd have bought 2 pies so you could take one home. She handed the basket she was carrying to Sarah. Although I should have known you'd have a visitor because I dropped a spoon on the table while I was making breakfast this morning. It was a large spoon, though. Usually means a family of visitors. So that was 2, right? That was 2. Okay. Yep. So one quote in this one, Murder in Chelsea. I think all of my co-hosts went to bed. I told you this is the middle of the night here. Um so I oh Luckily, her neighbor Mrs. Ellsworth came over to help the girls make a pot roast. The cooking lesson kept Catherine busy and distracted. Um Mrs. Brant, you look troubled. Is it obvious? Mrs. Ellsworth pulled off her apron and hung it up. I hope you weren't stewing over a difficult birth or nothing. Well, no. I shouldn't worry you with my troubles, but a woman went to the mission the other day asking for Catherine. Oh, okay. That's a spoiler. Alright. So that's not a quote. So we'll see what happens. Murder in Chelsea. Please go check out all my videos for these. Alright. Murder in Murray Hill, book 16. There's one quote. I know, she wants me to go up to bed. As soon as they finish these quotes, we'll go up to bed, okay? Um, uh, Good morning to you all, Mrs. Ellsworth said. Nelson asked me to bring you the leftover shortbread cookies so he won't be tempted to eat them himself. Your son might get married before Mr. Malloy and Mrs. Brant if you're not careful, Maeve said. It's possible, Mrs. Ellsworth said. We were eating hazelnuts the other evening when Mrs. Pringle was visiting, and Nelson cracked one that had 2 kernels in it. He gave one to Miss Pringle and ate the other himself. That's just being gentlemanly, Maeve says. It also means he's going to marry her, although I'm sure neither one of them had the slightest idea it did. He does. He marries her. Victoria Thompson, Murder on Amsterdam Avenue. One quote. I'm going to be up all night uploading these. Sarah and the girls were cleaning up the breakfast dishes when their neighbor Mrs. Ellsworth knocked on the door. Oh, Mrs. Brant, you mustn't give up hope. I broke a needle last night when I was mending Nelson's shirt. That always means a wedding will happen soon. You've been seeing wedding omens for years, Maeve reminded her. Well, some of them I made up, but this one is genuine. Stuck on murder on St. Nicholas. I got these all out of a library seal. Um, uh, let's see. And this is for your household made for Christmas good fortune. The holly brings good luck to men, and the ivy brings good luck to us females. We must always have them both together. That's only fair, don't you think? And let me know immediately if the ivy starts to wither. That's a very bad sign. And never burn the holly when it's still green. That's very bad luck. Morning Murder in Morningside Heights. Ah, one quote. Um, Your hair is getting very long, Mrs. Ellsworth told Catherine. Their neighbor had come by earlier, and Sarah had been visiting with her in the private parlor when Maeve brought Catherine in to join them. Maeve says it's straggly, Catherine said. She's going to cut it today. Oh my, Mrs. Ellsworth said. You can't cut her hair today. Why not? Maeve said. Because you can only cut a person's hair on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Do barbers know this? Maeve asked. Mrs. Ellsworth waved the question away. If you cut someone's hair on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, you will never grow rich. So I'm the one who has to be careful, Maeve said. But what about Sunday? Best never be born than Sunday shorn, and you must burn the hair clippings so they don't make a mess. I want to see what this other one is. It's not Mrs. Oh, this is what leads. This is the first hint of Sarah getting her own medical facility, the clinic. Um, Maybe you should be a midwife again, Mrs. Malloy, Gino said, earning a scowl from Malloy. I do miss my old vocation, Sarah admitted, but I don't miss being called out in the middle of the night and being away from home for days at a time. Maybe the ladies could come to you, Gino suggested with a wicked grin. You've enough room here. Sarah is perfectly happy being a wife and mother, Malloy said. How very progressive of you, Malloy. Malloy turned to Gino. That was not a compliment. Ah, I'm gonna miss these books. All right. One quote: "Murder in the Bowery." Ah. Oh my, bubbles in your cup, Mrs. Malloy, Mrs. Ellsworth said. That means money is coming. Sarah saw there was indeed a row of bubbles floating along the rim of her cup. That's always good news. How are the wedding plans coming along? Frank's getting money. Murder in Union Square, Book 21. Ah. Oh, this is when they're talking about a magazine. Um, They have, of course, in November, because married in veils of November mist, fortune your wedding ring has kissed. But I'm just saying a broken needle is a sure sign of a wedding, so that proves it. Murder on Trinity Place. Two quotes. Um, uh, Then Mrs. Ellsworth said, I don't suppose Mr. Malloy would be willing to do our first step this New Year's. You mean to be the first man to step over your threshold after midnight to bring your luck? Mrs. Ellsworth was notoriously superstitious. Doesn't Nelson usually do it? Yes, but I thought it would be fun to have someone else do it this year. We just need a dark-haired man to come in with a lump of coal and a few coins right after midnight to ensure us a prosperous 1900. And what was the other one? There's one other little one. Um, oh, they're talking about a year. Okay. So that was the Mrs. Ellsworth quote. Alright. Murder on Pleasant Avenue. One quote. Towards the very end of the book. Oh, I forgot to read the Franklin stuff. Oh. Um, what do you think of my new hat? Maeve asked. It's very nice, dear Mrs. Ellsworth said. Something wasn't right. Do you have it on backwards? Maeve reached up to touch it as if she could tell by feeling it was right or not. Mrs. Ellsworth gasped. What's wrong? Sarah asked. It's very bad luck to wear your hat backward, Maeve, dear. I don't need any bad luck today, not when I'm spending it with Gino's family. Yes, she's getting to know Gino's family. Okay. Murder on Wall Street. One quote. Um, I have an errand, but I don't have an appointment, so I'm not really in a hurry. Did you want to speak to me without something? Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, silently telling Mrs. Ellsworth she was available. You'll think I'm foolish old woman who is meddling where she has no business. Even so, I don't like people to think it. Um, and she's talking about Theta. Theta had this dream. Oh no, Mrs. Ellsworth was notoriously superstitious. A dream? Yes, she told me about it because it was so strange. What did she dream? She dreamed that she lost a pair of diamond earrings. Diamond earrings? Theta doesn't even own any diamond earrings. It doesn't matter if she does or not. The point is she dreamed she lost something very valuable. It's a common dream of pregnant women. That's a prediction that Theta is with child. Murder on Madison Square. One quote. Um, oh, this is Mrs. Ellsworth brings over the uh um Sarah talks to Theta, and Theta is talking about Mrs. Ellsworth. Um, there's like 3 pages of Mrs. Ellsworth here, but there's none of them that's her quote. Um, you have no idea how many superstitions there are about babies. I can't even keep track of them, much less try to avoid doing all the things that can be dangerous. That is only for when I'm expecting. After the baby is born, it just gets longer. Um, Mostly she has me not doing things. I can't go to the funeral because I can't look at a dead body or step over a grave. I have to be careful around cats too. I can't look at the moon too long or the baby will be moonstruck. Um, and she pulls out a sock. Yes, Nelson's sock. If you carry around your husband's sock, you won't go into early labor. And the one we just did the other day, Murder on Bedford Street. Uh, uh, I did just what you said, Theta reported. Sarah could even greet her. I walked around and waited until the contractions were 10 minutes apart to call you. Is everything all right? Nelson asked. That's perfectly normal. That's why they call it labor. Delivering a baby is hard work. Um, I'm not surprised. I untied every single knot in this entire house. You did what? Sarah asked. To loosen the way for the baby, Mrs. Ellsworth said. Sarah had heard the old superstition before, so she should have expected it from a notoriously superstitious neighbor. She even untied the knots in my nightdress, Theta said. It's practically falling off of me. I also put a knife under the bed, Mrs. Ellsworth said, and unlocked all the doors in the house. Is that all? Did I forget something? She's trying to pave the way for the baby. And our final Mrs. Ellsworth. Our final Mrs. Ellsworth. I hope you go check out my book reviews for all of these, my podcast for all of these books. They're so wonderful. Our final one. Oh, Mrs. Malloy, we had a bird in the house. A bird that was not unheard of course. When the weather was warm and the fireplace was not in use, occasionally a bird would fall down the chimney. Yes, a swallow. Oh, yes, it was flying all over the parlor, crashing into the mirror we have over the sideboard and bumping into the windows. Nelson had already left for work, so Theta and I had to deal with it ourselves. We opened the front door and all the windows, and then we both chased it with brooms. The babies were crying, and the poor bird kept trying to escape, but slamming into things. Did you get it out, or have you come for reinforcements? We finally managed to get it flying out the door, but it was too late by then, of course. Too late for what? The damage was already done, you see. A swallow in your house means someone is going to die. And there you go. That was the ominous warning. I talked about it in my podcast. That's it. That is all Mrs. Ellsworth's quotes in all 27 books. Oh, I enjoyed Mrs. Ellsworth tremendously. I hope you enjoyed Mrs. Ellsworth tremendously. Please go and check out my Star Trek Next Generation recaps and my If Then on Friday afternoons and Flashback Monday, and of course all of my daily book reviews, the J.D. Robb, Eve Dallas, the Janet Ivanovich, Stephanie Plum, all of the Gaslight series, all of the Krista Davis series, all of the Patterson's Murder Club series. Now we're doing Patterson Alex Cross series, the J.R. Ward series. Let's get going there. Have a good one.